Introduction to Poetry. For those of you who are in need of a comprehensive course for Introduction to Poetry, this video is for you. This is a 4-month course designed for English language students and others who have a keen interest in poetry and literature in general. I am Sikak Ekiko, and in today's video, we shall consider what poetry as an aspect of literature entails. The course has over 15 units that cover almost all the introductory information a student will need to understand poetry as a genre of literature. This information includes the nature of poetry as literature, definitions of poetry, uses of poetry, elements, techniques, and devices of poetry, and how to criticize or appreciate a poem, how to write a poem, and finally, for now, the different generations of African poetry and their respective thematic concerns. You are expected to go through this course guide carefully to know what the course is all about and the course materials you need. By the time you are through with the course, you will be confident enough to appreciate poetry, having acquired the necessary knowledge of what poetry is and how to recognize good and effective poetry from the poor and ineffective ones. Thus, you should also be able to write, analyze, or criticize a poem by focusing attention on the subject matter and the form or style. Going through this course will equip you specially for this purpose. Let me assure you that this course is a very interesting one, and it will prepare you for your future encounters with poetry as a field of study. Welcome on board once again. Course aim. This course is designed to expose you to the nature, uses, elements, techniques, and devices of poetry. Its aims include the following. 1. To enable you acquire an understanding of the character of poetry as a genre of literature. 2. To introduce you to the functions of poetry in the society. 3. To enable you to understand the elements, techniques, devices, and forms of poetry. 5. To impart you with the knowledge that will enable you to distinguish between effective and ineffective poetry. 6. To guide you on how to write poems. And finally, to expose you to the different generations of African poetry. Objectives of the course. By the end of this course, you should be able to define poetry as a form of writing or literature, discuss the element of poetry that you have been taught in the course, identify the different forms of poetry through their characteristic features, comment on the qualities of any given poem to demonstrate the skills of criticism, appreciation you have acquired in the course, and finally, write poems effectively. However, before we have an introductory discussion on poetry in particular, it is ideal we have an introductory discussion on literature in general. As you will know, literature is the art which imitates life in words with the twin objectives of entertaining and edifying. There have always been an unresolved argument as to whether literature inheres in the matter, subject, or object that it concerns itself with, or in its manner or style of expressing the matter of focus. What we mean here is this. When studying literature or when looking at literature, do we look at the concern? Do we look at the content? Do we look at the tale itself, or we look at the style, the manner and how the tale is being told? I leave that with you to answer. While these arguments are valid in locating literature in a particular space in the array of other written forms produced by man, it is the major features of the art that define it most precisely. In this regard, literature is best seen as the body of work, written or oral, in which a person's record of his or her experiences is given an artistic form. The literary cosmos is best marked by its qualities of imagination, creativity, and suggestiveness. These qualities are most explicitly discernible in poetry. Our focus in this course, which is the oldest of the major forms or genres of literature. Now the big question: what is literature? Literature is writing in which ideas of permanent and universal values or interests are expressed in a deliberately embellished language, the purpose of which is to please both sensually and intellectually, and teach by indirection. Compare this definition that gives us a clear idea of literature as both content, that is what it is said, and medium, meaning how the content is expressed, to the following definition by Ezra Pound. According to Ezra Pound, great literature is simply language charged with meaning to the utmost possible degree. The polarity of opinions regarding the exact nature of literature captures the age-old debate on whether literature or literariness should be judged merely by the subject or content of a work or by the style of its expression. We shall leave this question for now because you will have to form your opinion as you get to understand the workings of literature and define it with facts or illustrations. However, some of the foremost things that a reader needs to know about literature are its constitutive elements or characteristics, which are imagination, creativity, suggestion, or indirection. Imagination. Literature thrives essentially on imaginative constructs, which means that it is a form of composition that relies heavily on the composer's or writer's mental journey and take him or her beyond the realms of a given to a world of fantasy or of the mind. Hence, the literary artist is not always bound by the ordinary daily experience of people. For example, a raconteur or storyteller almost always takes his or her audience to improbable and indeterminable lands and times which are product of his or her imagination. Writers have led their readers through lands of giants, one-eyed monsters, flying humans, speaking animals, and forests. All these are emanations from their imagination. Some have presented environments that could best be described as replicas of heaven or hell in a bid to show their readers or audience to two poles of bliss or desire and repugnance or suffering and pain. Franz Kafka, in his story Metamorphosis, has given to written literature the unforgettable image of a young insurance executive who woke up in the morning to find that he had metamorphosed into a cockroach. All the extraordinary events and characters are products of literary invention or imagination. Imagination also comes into play in the literary art's use of events and experiences in his or her social environment, but imbuing them with imagined aspects or qualities which raise them above the ordinary. The imagination of the literary artist is also clearly visible in his or her use of language to express his or her experiences, be they real or imagined. A good artist always finds or imagines a fresh way of expressing ordinary experiences, thereby raising them to a level that appears to be out of ordinary. For example, in the simple but extraordinary expression, he watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt, he falls. The Victorian poet Alfred Lord Tennyson establishes a similarity between the speed of a thunderbolt and that of an eagle descending from a height to catch its prey. This poet has used his imagination to create this sense, and the reader's imagination is similarly excited. It is this collaboration that James Reeves so aptly described in the statement that most good poetry demands study and interpretation. It costs its maker much effort of thought, imagination, and feeling, and it is worthy of corresponding effort by its readers. Aristotle's opinion in his comparison of history and poetry is instructive in this discussion of literary imagination. He asserted that poetry is superior to history, just as the poet is superior to the historian, because the former is philosophical, expressing the probable, while the latter is factual, thriving on what has seen. Creativity. There is a very thin line that separates creativity that constitutes the bedrock of literature from imagination that we have discussed above. For one, there are both essential qualities and products of the artist. It is a competent artist that imagines the best forms that his or her matter and manner will take. Similarly, it is the artist who creates a fictive world in which his or her imagination plays among symbols to produce his or her work. So in essence, the two qualities overlap to give us a rounded or full understanding of the true nature of literature. The literary artist at the moment of creation is, in the words of Andrew Lang, as quoted by Brooke, a born visionary and mystic, beholding things unapparent, believing in experiences that were never actual. For example, British poets like William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Butler Yeats, who believed and claimed that some of their major works were handed to them by some supernatural mediums or agencies, are of this mode. Some of their poems at that time had their origins in historical and legendary materials, which were then imbued with extraordinary poetic touch. It is this faculty that gave to English literature, among many others, such great poems of the extraordinary and supernatural as Blake's Jerusalem and the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and Kubla Khan and Yeats' poem that incorporated the occult and mythology of Irish folklore. Suggestion and indirection. There is no other quality of literature that distinguishes it from other forms of writing than this quality of suggestiveness. While other forms of writing claim to be both imaginative and creative in their own ways, they are definitely not marked by the quality of indirection or suggestiveness, which is the exclusive domain of literary language. In fact, most factual writings, such as works on the sciences, history, geography, and so on, cannot afford to be purely suggestive in the manner that literature, especially poetry, is. Acclaimed literary critics William Emerson have recommended a certain degree of ambiguity for a work of literature worth the label. Emerson, in his discussion of what he identified as the 7 types of ambiguity, has stated the virtue of indirection in literary language. Forms or genres of literature. Literature, as you must have learned in your previous studies, comprises some major types of forms or genres. These major types, which could be further reduced to subtypes or categories, are 3, and they include poetry, drama, and prose. It is important for you to note that these literary types are not defined or based on thematic focus, since all the 3 types often share common themes as literature. They are categorized strictly by their stylistic features. Thus, The best approach to the study or understanding of these major forms is by noting their elements or defining characteristics, which are as follows. Poetry. Poetry is the oldest of the three major forms of literature, with roots deep in the rituals and religious observances of antiquity. Thus, it was mainly oral, performance-driven, and public as it was, more often than not, a tool for supplication, communal tribal celebration, and celebration of the supernatural, as well as appreciation of the gift of nature. From these early beginnings developed the personal and impersonal forms of poetry presented by the lyric on the one hand and by the traditional epic and ballad on the other hand. Features of poetry. Since we shall dwell on this form, that is poetry, in more detail in subsequent section of this course material, we shall now move on to briefly explain the defining features, namely imagery, sound, rhythm, and diction. Imagery. Imagery is the sensory language used in poetry. By sensory, we imply that the language appeals to or affects the senses of the reader or audience. Sound. Sound is the auditory aspect or quality inherent in poetry. The importance of this characteristic lies in the fact that poetry is meant to be heard, and in its original form it was a song, and most short lyrics today still retain this character. Rhythm. Rhythm is the wave-like movement discernible in poetry. It accounts, along with sound, for the musical quality in poetry. Diction. Diction refers to the special choice or selection of words utilized by the poet in his work. Drama. Drama was the second to evolve of the three major genres of literature to be studied in the course, and like poetry, it had its origin in ritual, song, and dance. Hence, a comprehensive definition of drama takes into account these defining strands. As you will notice in the definition that follows, drama is a story told through action by actors who impersonate the characters of the story. It is a work of literature designed to be presented on a stage in a theater by persons who impersonate or imitate the characters of other persons, speak and perform prescribed dialogues and action. For drama to exist, there must be characters who imitate or impersonate the species and actions of other persons on a stage in a theater. Hence, the defining characteristics or elements of this form are action, plot, dialogue, character, and setting. Finally, prose. Prose is an extended writing or narrative with human beings or humanized non-humans engaged in action over a period of time, and displaying varieties of human characters engaged in human relationship in situations that stimulate life. Despite its relative newness in relation to poetry and drama, the prose has developed by leaps and bounds to be the most popular and widely read of the three, and has successfully embraced and accommodated such subcategories as science fiction, fantasy, and utopia within its fold. The unifying factors that share are the following elements or defining features: story, plot, setting, and characterization. Function and uses of literature. As we have mentioned above, literature serves some important purpose in human society, the two major ones being entertainment and teaching of values. Along the lines of these two uses, critics have made large claims of the role of literature to include being the conscience of society. The writer is seen as the sensitive moral point of society who is constantly chiding errant humanity and pointing them in the right direction. To ensure that social harmony and health are maintained. B.B. Shelley, the Romantic poet, regards poetry, by extension literature generally, as the unacknowledged legislature of the world. While their both views of what literature is and is capable of doing in society may be debatable, there is no doubt that literature entertains and edifies through the creation of beauty, expression of thought, and expression of emotion. Conclusion: we have been able to go through some of the basic concepts of literature as an art form in this unit. This knowledge will serve as a good reference point as you study any of the forms of literature and poetry in particular. Finally, kindly subscribe to this channel if you haven't done that, and I believe you have found this content interesting. Please share this video with your friends out there on all social media platforms. See you in the next episode.